In the afternoon twilight of a northern Canadian forest, far from other small Native American bands, two mothers and three small children are rushing to build a shelter. The temperature is dropping, warning of a cold night ahead, and soon the men will return from hunting. The women move quickly, hacking down small trees and cutting off branches to make poles as support for a small teepee. They have carried a bundle of bark with them, but it must be warmed and softened before it can be unrolled and wrapped around the poles. The children are sent to search for dry sticks to start a fire. The teepee they are building may shelter the two families for as little as one night, or for as long as several weeks if the men continue to find moose. Tonight, for extra warmth, they will all grease their bodies with bear fat and tie in the sleeves of their beaver capes before going to sleep, huddled together, safe from wind and snow in their little bark shelter. This scene was common in the woodlands of northeastern Canada as recently as 100 years ago. But farther south on both sides of the Canada-United States border, 600 years earlier, Native Americans were building far grander structures. Where tribes were able to grow corn, they did not have to move in a continual search for food. They built longhouses, sometimes large enough to shelter 100 people for as long as 15 years. What both Native American structures, the tiniest teepee and the largest longhouse, had in common was the material used to build them. Wherever there were forests, there was some kind of bark. Birch, cedar, spruce, elm, basswood, ash, and oak. It was simple to cut, light to carry, and easy to work with. It was used as food, clothing, and medicine. Waterproof, it could be made into containers for drinking and cooking, for carrying or storing, and into canoes for traveling. But most ingenious of all was the way it was used to make shelters. The forests of northern Canada were once rich in animal life, and the Native Americans who lived by hunting moved often as they followed the herds. The teepee of bark became the common shelter. The search for usable bark went on all year round. When families passed through forests and noticed trees with good bark, they stripped off the lower branches. New bark would grow over the holes, leaving the trunk smooth. Birch bark was preferred over all other kinds because it came off the trees in larger strips and was light to carry. Bark requires careful handling or it splits. There was a precise time in the spring when it was best for peeling. As the sheets were cut and stripped from the trees, they were stretched flat on the ground and weighed down with stones. Rows of star-shaped holes were made along the edges with an awl. The women used tree roots, softened and split, for the sewing. Small openings around the stitches were sealed off with a waterproof mixture of tree gum and fish oil. These long strips of bark were then rolled up so they could be carried easily. Such rolls were highly valued and traded between tribes. The favored site for building a bark teepee in summer was on sandy soil close to water, with a hill nearby that allowed a view over the surrounding countryside, where breezes could blow away mosquitoes and black flies. In winter, a forest site was chosen where the trees gave protection from the wind. There were many variations on the teepee. The elongated teepee might have several fire pits and serve as many as 10 families. In the western subarctic, a double lean-to, combining wood and bark, was insulated with brush. How the teepee was built. First, a tripod was built. 3 young trees were trimmed of branches to make long poles. 2 of these poles were cut to a point at the top, and the other forked. The bottom ends were stuck into the ground and tilted inward to meet at the top. There, the 2 pointed sticks were fitted into the forked one. More straight, lightweight poles were then stuck in the ground, this time to form the conical teepee shape, and leaned against the first 3. 2 or 3 feet below the top, the poles were lashed together to make a firm frame for the bark covering. In cold weather, bark is very brittle, so it must be warmed before it can be unrolled or rolled. When flexible enough to handle, it was wrapped around the frame like a cape, starting at the bottom. Each row overlapped the one below it to allow rain to run off. More poles and branches were then laid against the sides to hold the bark in place and tied at the top. In winter, skins and brush might be added for insulation with a final covering of snow. Smoke from the fire escaped directly upward through the open peak. An opening left on one side as a door was covered by a flap of animal skin. Sometimes a tunnel entrance of brush and branches was added as a windbreak. The wigwam. The wigwam was a larger type of bark shelter. Although the word was used for many shapes, a true wigwam was domed, like an igloo. And like the igloo, it used heat and building materials efficiently. The dome kept the heat close to the ground where people sat or slept. It also made the wigwam roomier inside than the teepee because the walls did not tilt inward as steeply. A fire burned in a shallow pit in the center, and the smoke escaped through an opening at the top of the dome. In bad weather, this was closed off with a flap of bark attached to a long pole. The flap could be moved into different positions depending on which way the wind was blowing. This kept the smoke from drifting back inside. The wigwam was usually built to be lived in for a much longer time than the teepee by tribes that did not depend entirely on hunting and fishing for their food. Where they were able to grow corn or other grains, they could stay as long as the land was fertile, and it was not unusual to find 50 or even 100 wigwams clustered together into a village. Since disputes over territory or trade broke out between the tribes from time to time, such villages were usually surrounded by stockades, which are like fences made out of sticks stuck into the ground. The tools used by the Native Americans, made of stone and bone, look very crude to the modern eye, yet these axes, chisels, and knives were highly efficient instruments. When Samuel de Champlain watched Native Americans building forts in the early 1600s, he was impressed at the ease and speed with which the tools were used. Modern scientists, too, have been surprised when they tried using stone knives excavated from Native American sites. They found them to be sharp, fitted comfortably into the hand, and in some ways to be better than metal knives. How the wigwam was built. The wigwam was more difficult to build than the simple bark teepee. 16 to 20 long poles were planted in the ground in a circle about 15 feet, 4.5 meters across. They were arranged so that each pole had a mate on the opposite side of the circle. These pairs were then bent towards each other and lashed together with strips of basswood or cedar bark to form arches. Next, 2 or 3 rings of saplings were tied around the structure to increase its strength. To cover the outside, the Native Americans used whatever was available: bark, animal hides, even rush or grass mats made of cattails ingeniously sewn together to make them watertight. In cold weather, all of these might be combined in the same wigwam. Bark might be layered over an inside shell of mats, and then banked with leaves, green branches, or snow. For the bark roof, birch was best, being light and flexible, but chestnut, oak, and elm were also used. Sometimes a foot-high platform was built around the fire pit. This platform was spread with mats and soft skins to make a warm, comfortable place for sitting or sleeping. Wigwam walls in the more permanent settlements were lined with decorated mats. Like the bark teepee, the wigwam had an earthen floor covered with fir boughs that gave off a lovely scent. Skin or fur might be thrown over the branches for warmth. The people of the Longhouse. The Iroquois of New York State called themselves People of the Longhouse. Between 1350 and 1450, they built some of the biggest and most spectacular longhouses known. 5, then 6 nations united to form the Iroquoian Confederation. Other Iroquois nations did the same in southern Ontario and Quebec. They developed a form of government to maintain peace among themselves and kept simple records of treaties and trade ties. Their agriculture became more advanced and their villages more settled. Small beads made of shells, called wampum, were woven into sashes and used as mediums of exchange or money. Women had considerable status among the Iroquois. Each longhouse was governed by a matron, who might represent as many as 20 families in one shelter. She and other matrons selected a chief to speak for the household at council meetings. Children took their mother's clan name and belonged to 2 families. Their fireside family consisted of their parents and brothers and sisters, all living together in their section of the longhouse. The other family was made up of their mother's sisters and their children, and sometimes even of their grandmother's sisters and children. All the young children of these women were treated like brothers and sisters. This second family supervised the children's upbringing. Family members related to the fathers might live in the same settlement as well. When the first French explorers sailed up the St. Lawrence River in 1535, they found a huge, flourishing Iroquois settlement where Montreal stands today. This village of Hochelaga was protected by 3 rings of walls, 30 feet or 9 meters high, as high as the walls of most European fortresses of the time. Inside were some 50 large bark longhouses centered around a meeting place where ceremonies were performed and festivals celebrated. Outside the walls were fields of corn, beans, and squash. A century later, Champlain describes a longhouse community he visited in southern Ontario. Their cabins are a kind of arbor or bower covered with bark, approximately 50 or 60 yards long by 12 wide, with a passage 10 or 12 feet broad down the middle, from one end to the other. Along each side runs a bench 4 feet above ground, where the inmates sleep in summer to avoid the innumerable fleas. In winter, they sleep close to the fire on mats, underneath the benches where it is warmer, and they fill the hut with a supply of dry wood to burn in that season. A space is left at one end of the cabin for storing their maize, or corn, which they place in large bark barrels in the middle of the floor, and boards suspended overhead preserve their clothing, food, and other things from the numerous mice. There will be 12 fires to each cabin, making 24 families. The smoke circulates at will, causing much eye trouble, to which the natives are so subject that many become blind in their old age, for there is no window in the cabin, and no opening except a place in the roof where the smoke finds an outlet. Longhouses were sometimes longer than a football field. Even when they were much smaller, building them was an architectural feat that involved many family groups, sometimes the whole community. The longhouse might vary in length, but it was usually as high as it was wide. Posts about the thickness of a man's leg were set in 2 rows to form the outer frame. Then horizontal beams were stretched from one wall to another and lashed into place. The roof frame was made of lighter poles, about as thick as a man's arm. It might be arched or come to a point at the center, supported by a mast-like pole. The whole structure was then covered with bark, usually cedar, ash, or elm, because birch was not so common in southern areas. The birch was put on like shingles from the bottom up to let water run off, as in the teepee and the wigwam. Another set of poles was then lashed over the bark to keep it from blowing away. The longhouse had no windows, only doors at both ends, and a row of smoke holes down the center of the roof. Each of the related families in a longhouse had its own space along one wall, about 13 feet or 4 meters long. A cooking fire in the center aisle was shared with the family opposite. Some longhouses also had larger fire pits for winter heating. In the biggest longhouses, 3 platforms ran like shelves along both walls, one above the other. They had many uses: for working and sleeping, for storing food, clothes, firewood, tools, and weapons. In the wide center aisle, people cooked, ate, and chatted, squinting against the smoke. Some longhouses must have been very handsome. Walls outside the front were decorated with red and black pictures of birds, men, and beasts. They might show the totem or symbol of the clan that dwelt inside. When a stranger entered a village, he went to the longhouse identified with his mother's clan. He could count on a warm welcome even among his distant relatives. The longhouse was less crowded in summer when men and boys hunted and fished, while the women and children tended crops and lived in small shelters in the fields. Because plowing was unknown, the soil around the village lost its fertility after 10 or 15 years of planting, and families had to move. The site of their new village would already have been chosen a few years earlier. Trees were burned down and stumps dug up to clear the earth. Then a clean new longhouse was built, and whatever was still useful was moved from the old home. The longhouse was not a perfect shelter. Villages had communal garbage dumps, but years of close living meant that dirt, vermin, and insects accumulated inside. In rainy weather, smoke holes had to be at least partly covered, and the inhabitants sometimes had to lie down to avoid the smoke. The arrival of Europeans meant the days of the longhouse were numbered. For all its value as a building material, bark had serious drawbacks. It was flammable and fragile. It could withstand neither the heat nor the firepower of the new weapons the invaders brought. But for centuries before their arrival, the bark longhouse had been one of the largest and most impressive native structures north of Mexico. Few bark houses are built today unless for museums. The great longhouses are now only a dim memory, but sites continue to be excavated, telling us more about the remarkable Native American tribes that built them.